What if I told you that one of America's most powerful self-proclaimed prophets, a man followed by thousands, has just been accused of running a multi-million-dollar slavery ring inside his own church? The FBI says David E. Taylor, the man once worshipped as a divine messenger, has been arrested in connection to a $50 million church scandal that allegedly trapped vulnerable followers into lives of control, abuse, and exploitation. But here's the chilling part. This story is far bigger and darker than anyone imagined, and what investigators uncovered could shake the foundations of modern-day megachurch culture forever. David E. Taylor's arrest has sent shockwaves across the religious world. For years, he presented himself as a prophet, a healer, and a leader who claimed to speak directly with God. His ministry attracted thousands of loyal followers, many of whom gave up their money, their careers, and in some cases, even their families in hopes of being part of something greater. But behind the scenes, investigators say something much darker was taking place. According to federal authorities, Taylor's so-called church was nothing more than a front for a $50 million operation built on manipulation, financial fraud, and what some are now calling modern-day slavery. Allegations range from unpaid labor and psychological control to lavish spending on luxury cars, designer suits, and multi-million-dollar properties, all while followers lived in poverty and fear. In today's deep dive, we're going to break down everything you need to know about this scandal. We'll cover how the FBI launched its investigation, the shocking testimonies of former members, the money trail that led to Taylor's downfall, and the possible prison sentence he could now be facing. Stay with me because this is not just the story of one fallen leader. It's a cautionary tale about blind faith, power, and the devastating cost of unchecked authority. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll see why this case is being called one of the most explosive scandals in modern church history. To understand the gravity of the scandal, we first need to look at the man at the center of it all, David E. Taylor. Born in the 1970s, Taylor grew up in a modest background, far from the luxury he later surrounded himself with. According to his own accounts, he experienced a life-changing vision of Jesus Christ as a teenager. He claimed that this encounter transformed his life and set him on a divine mission. That story became the foundation of his ministry, and over time, it would be repeated, dramatized, and broadcast to thousands of believers who saw him as chosen. Taylor began preaching in small gatherings, often blending emotional sermons with promises of miracles, healings, and direct encounters with God. His charisma and bold claims quickly drew attention. By the early 2000s, he had established the Joshua Media Ministries International, or JMMI. From the outside, it looked like a powerful spiritual movement dedicated to prayer, revival, and spreading the word of God. But behind the curtain, former members say JMMI was more like a cult, where Taylor's word was absolute and questioning him was unthinkable. Through televised sermons, conferences, and glossy promotional material, Taylor cultivated an image of a modern-day prophet. He told followers that he regularly had face-to-face meetings with Jesus and even visited heaven. These extraordinary claims weren't just spiritual teachings. They were powerful marketing tools. People desperate for hope, healing, and meaning were drawn in by the idea of being connected to a man who claimed to have a direct line to God himself. Financially, Taylor's ministry began to skyrocket. Donations poured in, sometimes in the form of small offerings from struggling families, other times in massive lump sums from wealthy followers who believed they were sowing into God's kingdom. According to court records and former members, some gave away their life savings, retirement funds, and even homes, convinced that their sacrifice would lead to blessings. This loyalty and financial dependence gave Taylor immense power. Reports suggest he lived a lavish lifestyle, designer suits, expensive cars, first-class travel, and even a multi-million-dollar mansion. And while he preached sacrifice to his congregation, insiders claim he rarely practiced it himself. Instead, his wealth and influence only continued to grow. But as Taylor's empire expanded, so did the whispers of abuse. Former members began to share disturbing stories of being forced to work long hours without pay, of being cut off from their families, of being told that disobedience to Taylor was the same as disobedience to God. Slowly, what began as a religious movement started to look less like a church and more like a high-control organization, what some would boldly call a cult. And this is where the FBI's interest began to take shape. Because once millions of dollars are involved, and once vulnerable people are allegedly being exploited, federal authorities start paying attention. But how exactly did the investigation begin? Who first blew the whistle? And what did the FBI discover when they started pulling back the layers of Taylor's multi-million-dollar ministry? That's where things take an even darker turn. The rise of David Taylor might have looked unstoppable from the outside, but every empire has cracks. And for Taylor, those cracks began to show when brave former members started speaking out. According to multiple reports, whispers of abuse inside Joshua Media Ministries International had circulated for years. Former followers described being overworked, manipulated, and forced into silence through fear of divine punishment. But for the longest time, these testimonies were ignored. After all, Taylor was a charismatic figure with thousands of loyal supporters who would dismiss any criticism as persecution against a man of God. That all changed when a handful of whistleblowers decided they could no longer remain silent. Some had spent years inside the ministry, giving up everything they owned and cutting ties with their families. When they left, they carried scars, not just emotional and spiritual, but financial as well. They claimed they had been stripped of their money, their independence, and even their sense of self-worth. One former member testified that she was forced to work 16-hour days cleaning, cooking, and even doing manual labor for Taylor's properties without a paycheck. Another claimed that she was pressured to hand over her bank accounts and told that keeping money for herself was a form of disobedience to God. These allegations painted a horrifying picture. A ministry that looked holy on the surface, but behind closed doors resembled something closer to modern-day slavery. Eventually, these testimonies reached the ears of journalists, attorneys, and finally federal investigators. The FBI began quietly monitoring Taylor's organization. They started tracking financial records, interviewing former members, and building a case. What they uncovered was staggering. According to court filings, the ministry was allegedly operating as a $50 million empire fueled by manipulation and fraud. Donations that were meant for God's work were reportedly funneled into luxury spending, high-end cars, designer clothing, lavish real estate, and expensive travel. Former members even claimed that Taylor used ministry funds to pay for cosmetic surgeries, spa treatments, and other personal indulgences. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was how the ministry allegedly kept its workers under control. Investigators say followers were pressured to cut ties with their families, convinced that outsiders were enemies trying to pull them away from God's purpose. Inside the ministry, loyalty to Taylor was absolute. Dissenters were shamed, humiliated, and sometimes threatened with eternal damnation. The FBI later described it as a system of psychological captivity where victims felt they had no choice but to obey. The investigation also revealed another troubling detail. Some of the so-called donations may not have been freely given at all. Instead, investigators suspect that members were manipulated, coerced, or outright defrauded into handing over their assets. In some cases, vulnerable individuals who had little money to begin with were left destitute, while Taylor and his inner circle lived like royalty. But the turning point came when financial documents leaked. Documents that showed massive discrepancies between what the ministry reported to the IRS and what Taylor was actually spending. These papers gave investigators the proof they needed to act. After months of surveillance, interviews, and financial audits, the FBI prepared to move in. Taylor, the self-proclaimed prophet who claimed to speak directly to Jesus, was about to face the earthly reality of federal charges. And when the arrest finally came, it wasn't just shocking, it was historic. But before we get to that dramatic moment, we need to look closer at what life inside Joshua Media Ministries was really like for its members. Because it's those disturbing first-hand accounts that reveal the true human cost of Taylor's empire. When you peel back the glittering stage lights, the polished sermons, and the promises of miracles, a much darker reality emerges inside David E. Taylor's ministry. To his loyal followers, Joshua Media Ministries International was a gateway to heaven on earth. But to those who escaped, it was a prison of fear, manipulation, and exploitation. Former members describe a culture of absolute control. Taylor wasn't just a pastor. He was presented as a divine authority figure whose words carried the weight of God.